After my father's funeral, we realized that the peace we'd been seeking after my father's death was fleeting and that very soon we'd be plunged into the hectic daily existence that awaited us. In addition to our deep sorrow at what had happened to my father, being surrounded by secret agents and dozens of journalists lying in wait indicated that our confinement in that hotel in downtown Bogotá was going to be tumultuous. At the same time, our lack of money started to cause problems for us almost immediately. My father was dead, and we had no one to turn to for help. We'd been staying in that upscale hotel in Bogotá since November 29th, and to reduce the risks around us we'd rented the entire 29th floor even though we occupied only 5 rooms. Our financial predicament became more dire in mid-December, when the hotel sent us the first bill for lodging and food, which, to our surprise, also included the tab for the government's security team. It was an astronomical sum thanks to the large quantities of food and drink they'd ordered. They consumed shrimp, lobster, shellfish stew, and pricey cuts of meat, as well as all sorts of hard alcohol, especially whiskey, seeming to have deliberately chosen the most expensive items on the menu. We paid the bill, but our money worries continued to grow, with no solution in sight. One day, my aunts Alba Marina and Luz Maria's husband, Leonardo, and their 3 children, Leonardo, Mary Luz, and Sarah, came to the hotel. Though we hadn't seen each other for months and weren't really close, we were glad for the visit. My little sister finally had someone to play dolls with, after having spent almost a year indoors without being allowed to look out a window, without knowing where she was, and without an explanation for why she was always surrounded by more than 20 men armed to the teeth. We sat down at the dining table, and after describing what we'd been through in the last few weeks, my mother mentioned her concern over how little money we had. We discussed the matter for a long time, and the compassion and generosity that Alba Marina exhibited made me think that she was the right person to help. I needed her to retrieve an unknown amount of cash that my father had hidden in 2 stashes at the property we called the Blue House. It was time to go get it so we could have a bit of financial breathing room. As I moved to a seat next to her, I remembered that the apartment we were staying in was still being monitored by the authorities, who had not only bugged our phones but probably also installed microphones throughout the place. I had searched for them many times, dismantling lamps, telephones, furniture, and all sorts of other objects. I had even poked around for them in the electrical outlets, but in doing so I'd caused a short circuit that had knocked out the electricity to the whole floor. I decided to whisper my secret in her ear. First I put on the television and turned the volume way up. Then I told her. One night during our period of suffocating confinement in the Blue House, my father decided to take stock of his finances. When everybody was sleeping, he took me to 2 different hiding places he'd had built in the house. He showed me the boxes where cash was hidden and said that, apart from him and Naomi, the only other person who knew about them was his man, Fatty. Then he added that my mother and sister and, most of all, his siblings must never learn that secret. According to my father, the 2 caches had enough money to win the war and get us back on our feet. Therefore, we had to manage it carefully. He also told me that a while back he'd sent $6 million to his brother Roberto. 3 for Roberto's expenses while in prison and the other 3 for him to keep for us in case we needed it. If something happened to my father, Roberto had specific instructions to give us the money. Once my account was over, I got right to the point. Auntie, would you be willing to go to Medellin to get the money that's stashed in those 2 hiding places? We don't have anyone else we can ask, and there's no way we can go. Alba Marina had a reputation for being tough, and she immediately agreed. So I revealed the exact locations of the hiding places in the blue house, one in the living room near the fireplace and another in the clothes-drying courtyard behind a thick wall. And told her not to say anything to anybody, to go there alone, at night, preferably. Using someone else's car, to take a very indirect route to the house, and to keep an eye on her rearview mirrors to make sure she wasn't being followed. Finally, I wrote a letter to Fatty authorizing my aunt to remove the boxes of money. After I'd given the instructions, I asked her if she was scared. "I won't be intimidated. I'll go after that money wherever it is," she said firmly. My aunt returned 3 days later, and when she walked into the hotel room, she wasn't looking so positive. My first thought was that something had gone wrong. I asked for the keys to one of the empty rooms on the floor and met with her alone. "Juan Pablo, there was only a little bit of money at the blue house, that's it," she said. All in a rush. I was silent for a few minutes, disconcerted. I didn't doubt her story and directed my rage against Fatty, the guard, who'd probably stolen the caches. A flood of questions remained after the money's disappearance, but we had to keep quiet because we didn't have a way to contest my aunt's version of events. I'd never dared to doubt her, since on several occasions I'd noticed that she was loyal to my father. All in all, money-related matters were far from being settled. In mid-March 1994, 3 months after we moved into Residencias Tequendama, we rented a large, 2-story apartment in the Santa Ana neighborhood to reduce costs. Not only were we running out of money, but we were also still in danger, so at all times we had a security detail of agents from DGene, CGene, the DAS, and the CTI. Without the stashes from the Blue House, our situation became urgent, so we decided to ask my aunt and uncle for the $3 million that my father had given Roberto to hold for us. We assumed they'd already spent a good bit of the money. When we requested it, we got an explanation fairly quickly. It came in the form of my grandmother Hermilda and my father's siblings Gloria, Alba Marina, Luz Maria, and Argemiro, who visited the Santa Ana apartment one afternoon to keep the guards on the first floor from overhearing our conversation. We gathered in my mother's room on the second floor. They pulled out several sheets of paper that had been torn out of a notebook, as if we were dealing with the accounts of a small neighborhood shop. The papers listed the expenses of the last few months, $300,000 to furnish my aunt Gloria's new apartment, $40,000 for a taxi for Gloria as a business investment, and countless outlays of money for my grandfather Abel, for the butler's wages, for car repair, and to buy a car to replace one that had been confiscated, among many other things. It was as if, with this list, they sought to justify the way Roberto had squandered 3/4 of the money that my father had entrusted to his care. Roberto was willing to honor only the amount that remained. Irritated, I questioned the expenses, which seemed to me utterly profligate, focusing in on the astounding cost of my Aunt Gloria's furniture. She got flustered and asked me if she didn't have the right to replace the things she'd lost in the war. Despite her tantrum, I knew the accounts had to have been cooked. It wasn't plausible that the furniture was worth more than the apartment itself. Alba Marina backed her up and said that Roberto hadn't frittered the money away. I told them I wasn't convinced by their neat numbers, and the meeting with my grandmother and my father's siblings ended on sour terms. It was clear we weren't going to get the money back. As I pondered what to do, my mind shifted gears. 4 weeks now we'd been receiving threats from at least 30 men in prison who'd worked for my father and had been set adrift in the wake of his death. I knew that the only way to get Roberto to let go of that money was to force him to give it to the prisoners. According to my calculations, the money would be enough for them for a year. That was a commitment we thought we owed the people who'd joined my father in his war, and were now serving long sentences as a result. My father always used to say that you can't just abandon people to their fate in prison. That was when they needed help the most. Whenever his men told him, "Boss, they got so-and-so," he'd send lawyers to defend the man and make sure the family received some money. That's how my father treated every single one of the people who fell while helping him carry out his misdeeds. So to avoid more problems from the prisons, we asked Roberto to use the remaining money to aid those men and their families. But the entire business was born under a bad star. Distributing that money turned out to be a whole new headache for us, and eventually a breaking point in our increasingly strained relations with my relatives. Weeks after the turbulent meeting, we got news from some of the prisons that we found quite worrying. One account suggested that my grandmother Hermilda had visited a number of the men and claimed that Roberto was the one providing the money. I knew I had to send letters to the prisons to tell my father's men the truth. Soon, though, despite my efforts, we again started having problems because the men had stopped receiving money from Roberto. Several of them complained that they had no way to feed or protect their families and pointed out that they'd given everything for the boss, accusing us of being ungrateful. Roberto must have blamed us. Uneasy, I called Roberto, and he had no compunction in telling me that the money had lasted only 5 months. The message from the prisons contained a veiled threat, so I sent a reply explaining that the money they'd been getting had been not from my uncle but from my father. All of your salaries, your lawyers, and your meals have been paid for so far with my father's money, not Roberto's. Let's make that quite clear. It is not our fault that Roberto has spent all of that money. When they told us the money was gone, they told us my Aunt Gloria had spent it, but it was never clear to us where that money actually went. Roberto must have found out what was going on, as a few days after I sent my letter, he wrote a note to my mother for Mother's Day. The handwritten letter clearly attempted to use the assassination attempt he'd survived back in December to justify his behavior. "Tata," he said, using my mother's nickname, "I'm not the same man I was before. I'm quite depressed about what I'm going through. Though I've gotten a little better, it's been 5 months of suffering, with what happened to my brother and then my own near-death experience. Don't listen to all the gossip, there are so many people who do not love us. I have a lot to talk to you about, but I'm really depressed about my situation." Reports of the family squabble over financial support for the prisoners reached the ears of Ivan Urdinola, one of the capos from the Norte del Valle cartel, whom my mother had met with a couple of times at Bogotá's La Modelo prison as the Colombian cartels attempted to restore order following my father's death. On his personal letterhead, Urdinola sent my mother a note in which his tone was cordial but commanding. "Señora, I am sending this letter to request that you please clear up your misunderstandings with the Escobar family. It's not Pablo's men's fault that Roberto doesn't have the money. Please help them out, that's what we're all here for, and you are the closest to this matter as the new head of the family. You will continue to have problems as long as this matter goes unresolved." But that wasn't the end of it. On the morning of August 19, 1994, I was lying in bed when a fax came in that left me cold. It was a letter signed by several of the men who'd worked for my father and were now being held at the Itagüí maximum security prison. And it contained serious accusations against Roberto. Dona Victoria, a warm greeting to you and please give our regards to your children. Juancho and Manuela, as well. We are sending this letter to clear up certain rumors being spread by Señor Roberto Escobar. We are notifying you because we realized what he was trying to do by sending his sister Gloria to throw your son under the bus. We wish to notify you that Roberto has said that unless certain statements are retracted, he will keep this going. We want to make our position quite clear: none of us is willing to participate in this game of deceit and abuse. We don't want conflict with anybody. What we want is to live in peace. If he goes through with this, it's on his own and at his own risk because none of us are going to participate in the least. We were firm with him, and we will be firm with you as well. The message was signed by many of my father's men, Giovanni Lopera, known as the Supermodel, along with Comanche, Mystery, Tato Avendano, The Claw, Polystyrene, Fatty Lambas, Valentin de Jesus Taborda, and William Cardenas. After reading the names of the men who had signed the message, I was worried, so I decided to tell Gustavo de Grafe, the Attorney General of Colombia, to stymie any possible setup by my uncle. I had no option but to put a stop to Roberto's deceit and dodge the rocks he was throwing at me. De Grafe met me along with our lawyer, Fernandez, and I expressed my concern that there was a plan afoot to get me thrown in prison. I also informed him that two of the prisoners in Itagüí who had not signed the letter, Juan Urquio and Neris, had joined forces with Roberto and were attempting to collect on my father's supposed drug trafficking-related debts. Roberto hadn't expected us to have the ability or courage to stand up to him. We'd barely gotten out of this difficulty when something else happened to prove the accuracy of the old saying that lies stand on one leg, and the truth on two. At 11 o'clock one night in September 1994, a CGN agent called up from the street at the Santa Ana apartment and said that a man who identified himself as Fatty had just arrived and wanted to see me, but he refused to give his identification number and real name, as was required of anyone who wanted to talk to us. The officer was strict in adhering to this rule, which didn't surprise me. We knew that wherever we were, whether it was back in the Altos apartment building in Medellin or in Residencias Tequendama or now Santa Ana in Bogota, the people protecting us were also doing intelligence work to find out who had it in for us and who was on our side. The true surprise was that the man in question was none other than the one who'd been guarding my father's money, the one I'd accused of stealing the cash hidden in the Blue House. If he's got the nerve to show up at this hour of night, I'm going to ask him about the missing money, I said to myself. After a brief argument, I managed to persuade the officer to allow Fatty to come up without showing any identification, with the understanding that it was at my own risk. When he reached the door, Fatty hugged me and started to cry. "Juancho, my brother," he said, "it's so good to see you." I couldn't mask my shock. The man's embrace and tears seemed sincere. What's more, he was dressed the same as ever, in his ordinary clothing and battered tennis shoes. He didn't look in the least like someone who just a few months earlier had stolen a cache of money. Plus, why would he come visit us when that money should have set him up for life? Looking him up and down with suspicion and warily listening to his account of life. Since my father and the rest of the family had left the Blue House in November 1993, I concluded that he was still the loyal man we'd known. After we chatted for a few minutes on the second-floor balcony, where nobody could hear us, I decided it was time to ask him about the missing money. "Fatty, tell me what happened with the stash at the Blue House. Did you let my aunt in? What happened to the money?" "Juancho, I let your aunt in on your instructions. When she gave me the message, we went to the 2 locations and removed the boxes, and I helped her put them in the back of the SUV she'd brought. I never heard from her again. I just came to say hello, to hear how you were doing, because I'm very fond of you all. I am ready to help however I can. Well, she claims there was only a little money, I told him. That's a lie. I helped her load all that money into the SUV. It was so full of money that the back of the vehicle was riding lower to the ground. I swear, your aunt took everything, he said, almost in tears. If you want, I'll stay here while you call her, and I'll say it to her face. In his will, my father had left a percentage of his estate to the Escobar Gavirias, and we'd informed them immediately after his death, prepared to comply with his wishes to a T. In the document, he indicated that 50% of his estate should go to my mother. As his conjugal partner, 37.5% to me. Manuela had not yet been born when he wrote his will, and the remaining 12.5%, referred to as the freely disposable portion, to my grandparents Hermilda and Abel, my father's siblings, and one of his aunts. The will clearly stipulated the percentages of each bequest, but my father only had $30,000 in stocks and a 1977 Mercedes-Benz in his name, and that had all been confiscated. My father had acquired a large quantity of real estate and other assets, but they weren't deeded in his name. Some were in my and Manuela's names, but those had already been seized by the Attorney General's office. It wasn't easy settling my father's inheritance with his family, but after a couple of meetings in which they tried to take more, they finally relented. The Escobar Gavirias ended up receiving a large number of properties that were not under legal constraint. These included rural estates, lots in Medellin, the Blue House in Las Palmas, an apartment near the army base of the 4th Brigade, and the house in the Los Colores neighborhood that my father had purchased as a newlywed and which my Aunt Gloria had claimed, saying that he'd given it to her as a gift. We were left with the Monaco, Dallas, and Avni buildings in Medellin and the Napoles estate in Puerto Triunfo. Though they were currently in the possession of the Attorney General's office, we hoped that we might be able to recover them. Members of various cartels and paramilitary groups who had fought the war against my father had been demanding reparation for the costs he caused them, and calling for my head. The months to come we'd have to face some of the most powerful and dangerous leaders in the country to bargain for our lives with money we didn't have. By the summer of 1994, we would manage to make peace with the cartels and leave everything having to do with my Escobar relatives behind, moving first to Mozambique, and then to Buenos Aires, and starting over with very little to our name, and new identities. But conflict with my father's family over money would rear its ugly head again when my grandfather and then grandmother passed away, and my father's relatives refused to give Manuela and me our inheritances. It would take until 2014 for everything to be resolved. I remember one proceeding in which the judge set up an inquiry with my mother and me and refused to allow us to give the interview at the Colombian consulate in Buenos Aires. Instead, we had to travel to Medellin. I was worried that my father's family would find out the exact place and time of our appointment in court. Frightened, I requested assistance and protection from relatives and friends, who loaned me an armored car and 4 bodyguards. The meeting began much later than scheduled because the judge arrived late. Some of my aunts and uncles were represented by the lawyer Magdalena Vallejo, who opened the meeting and asked questions clearly intended to confuse me. But I shut her down with a response I'd prepared some time earlier. Regardless of your questions, the fact is that none of my father's siblings have fulfilled their responsibilities. They have kept all of the assets and left us nothing. After I provided the same answer to 5 questions in a row, the lawyer, visibly exasperated, gave up. Before bringing the meeting to a close, the court asked if I wanted to add anything. I looked at Magdalena and told her that I didn't understand why she was so angry with me when she knew that my little sister and I were the ones being wronged. Juan Pablo, it's not the 1980s. Your family isn't in charge anymore. I have plenty of friends and acquaintances in positions of power who will protect me, she replied. I told the court I wished to add something else on the record. I want it to be quite clear that I am ashamed to have to turn to the judicial system to remind my father's siblings that Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria existed and was their brother and their sole benefactor. Not a single member of my paternal family ever made a living on his own. All of them, without exception, have what they have today because of my father, not through their own efforts. Colombia hasn't forgotten who Pablo Escobar was, but his own family has.